parents blindsided me with a family emergency and demanded I hand over my house to my jobless brother, unleashed a smear campaign against me when I refused. Then my brother tried to break in. I never thought my own parents, the people who raised me, who were supposed to have my back no matter what, would be the ones to betray me. But if the past year has taught me anything, it's this. Family can cut you the deepest. And the worst part? They won't even flinch while doing it. Let me give you some context. I'm 32 years old. 5 years ago, after years of grinding, I finally became a homeowner. No handouts, no lucky breaks, just pure hustle. I worked long hours, lived frugally, skipped vacations while my friends traveled the world, and stretched every dollar as far as it could go. Instant noodles became my best friend on more nights than I care to admit. But in the end, it was worth it. I signed those papers, got those keys, and stepped into something that was entirely mine. A modest 2-bedroom, 1.5-bath house in a decent neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. Just a place where I could breathe, exist, and finally feel like all my sacrifices had amounted to something real. And then there's my younger brother, Ryan. Ryan is 29, but responsibility has always been a foreign concept to him. He's never held a job for more than a year, bouncing from one half-hearted pursuit to the next, chasing big ideas that never pan out. There's always some next big thing, some foolproof scheme that'll make him rich, and yet he's always broke, always in need of a bailout. And my parents? They enable him, time and time again, despite swearing that each rescue would be the last. But the truth is, Ryan wasn't always like this. As kids, we were inseparable. We built forts out of bedsheets, had epic video game marathons, and got into all sorts of mischief together. Back then, he was my best friend, my partner in crime. But as we got older, our paths started to split. I took on summer jobs, learning the value of a paycheck, while Ryan burned through his allowance on things he didn't need. I went to college, determined to carve out a future, while he drifted from one community college to another, never finishing a program, never committing to anything for long. And every time he stumbled, my parents had an excuse lined up. He just needs time to figure things out. Not everyone moves at the same pace. He'll get there eventually. Except he never did. Then last year everything changed. My dad had a health scare. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to shake them. Enough to make them start talking about their legacy, about what would happen after they were gone. That's when they dropped the bombshell. They wanted me to give my house to Ryan. At first I laughed, because it had to be a joke, right? A ridiculous, over-the-top, not-so-funny joke. But as I looked at their faces, solemn, expectant, I realized they weren't joking at all. They sat me down, their expressions grave, like they were about to deliver some profound wisdom. My mom folded her hands on the table. My dad sighed heavily, like this was difficult for them. And then they hit me with it. Ryan needs a fresh start. It's not fair that you have a house, and he doesn't. He's going through a rough time. He needs stability. I blinked at them, struggling to process what I was hearing. Then let him rent, I said. Or better yet, let him move back in with you. They shook their heads, already dismissing my words before I'd even finished speaking. He needs a real home, my mom insisted, her voice laced with barely concealed guilt tripping, as if I was the one being unreasonable. He can't keep starting over. I sat there, stunned. They actually expected me to give my house away? The house I had poured blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice into? And to Ryan, of all people, the one person who had never made a responsible choice in his life? You'll get another one, my dad said, waving a hand like houses just fell from the sky. You make good money. You can start over. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like they didn't even grasp what they were asking me to do. Like they had completely disregarded everything I had worked for. So I said no. Firmly. Absolutely. Unequivocally. No. And that's when the real drama began. They didn't take my refusal well. At first, it was guilt trips, classic parental manipulation, finely honed from years of practice. My mom started calling more often, her voice heavy with exaggerated sighs, like she was carrying the weight of my supposed betrayal on her shoulders. I'm just so disappointed in you, she would say, drawing out the words as if they physically pained her. I thought you were better than this. I thought you understood the importance of family." My dad took a different approach, shaking his head whenever we spoke, muttering under his breath about how family takes care of each other, about how a house is just a thing, but blood is forever. And then there was Ryan, who, naturally, leaned hard into his favorite role, the victim. "Man, I just need a break," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured defeat. "You don't know what it's like struggling all the time." Oh, I knew what it was like. I knew it intimately. I had lived it, breathed it, fought against it. The difference was I hadn't sat around waiting for someone to hand me a lifeline. I had clawed my way up on my own. But, of course, Ryan wasn't interested in hearing that. That would require admitting he had choices, that he had simply chosen wrong. When the guilt trips didn't work, they escalated. Suddenly, extended family members, people who had never once cared about my financial situation, started coming out of the woodwork, armed with opinions they hadn't been invited to share. My aunt called me out of nowhere, her tone thick with disapproval. "Why are you being so cruel to your own brother?" she demanded, as if I had thrown him onto the streets instead of simply refusing to gift him my house. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in years slid into my Facebook messages with a passive-aggressive reminder that family comes first. And the kicker? My grandmother, who, let me remind you, doesn't even live in this country, left me a voicemail telling me she was praying for my soul because I was letting greed ruin the family. It was insanity, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Because once the emotional blackmail failed, my parents dropped all pretense of subtlety and went straight into full-blown scheming. One day, I came home after work, exhausted and just wanted to unwind, only to find that Ryan had moved some of his stuff into my garage. Boxes of clothes, a cheap bookshelf, a second-hand couch, a few storage bins. Not a ton, but enough. Enough to make my blood boil. He hadn't even asked, hadn't even warned me. No, my parents had given him the garage code and told him he could start getting settled. Like this was already decided. Like my house had never really been mine to begin with. I saw red. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking with rage, and called them on the spot. The second my mom picked up, I unleashed. "Are you serious? You thought you could just sneak him in like a squatter, and I'd roll over?" And do you know what she had the nerve to say? She sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was overreacting. "We thought you'd come around." I hung up on her, and that night, I changed the garage code. But they weren't done, because if emotional manipulation and sneaky backdoor tactics didn't work, they were going to try and take my house legally. My dad, who, mind you, had never brought this up before, suddenly decided to remind me that he had contributed part of the down payment when I first bought the house. A contribution I had paid back in full. Every single cent. But now, conveniently, he was acting like it gave him some kind of claim on my property. "I helped you buy that house," he said one day, his tone almost rehearsed, like he had been practicing his argument. "We could argue that it should be considered a family asset." Oh, so now it was a family asset? The same house they had never lifted a finger to maintain, had never contributed a dime toward, had never even set foot in since I moved in? Now it was suddenly ours? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But just when I thought they had hit rock bottom, they started digging. Because the next thing I knew, Ryan showed up at my doorstep with a lease agreement. A literal printed-out, official-looking lease agreement, drafted, of course, by my parents. I snatched it from his hands and skimmed over it. And what I read, it nearly made me laugh out loud. The document claimed that I was permitting Ryan to live in my house rent-free for the next 5 years, that I would cover all utilities and maintenance, that I was essentially his personal landlord, except with none of the benefits and all of the responsibilities. Ryan, standing there, had the audacity to highlight specific clauses, as if he was doing me a favor by letting me stay in my own house. "You don't even have to move out," he said, flashing a smug little grin. "We could just be roommates." I let out a short, humorless laugh. Then I ripped the paper in half. Not in a million years. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about Ryan needing a place to stay. This wasn't just about my parents being overbearing. They were actually trying to find a way to take my house from me. My own parents. I was done playing nice. No more guilt trips. No more pretending. My parents weren't trying to persuade me anymore. They were going for the jugular. And the first real blow came from my father. My calm, logical, reasonable father, The one who had always been the voice of balance. The man who rarely lost his temper, who always seemed to pride himself on being the rational one, finally snapped. His voice was cold, clipped. His expression? Pure disappointment. If you don't do this for your brother, he said, his jaw tight, then don't expect us to be there when you need family. Just like that. A lifetime of parental support, conditional. If that's how you feel, I replied, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Then I guess I know where we stand. You're turning your back on us, he said, shaking his head like I was some kind of traitor. Like I was the one destroying our family, not them. The words stung. Of course they did. But I forced myself to push past the emotion, to see the truth underneath the manipulation. If family means letting people walk all over me, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching, then maybe I don't need it. And from that moment on, the battle lines were drawn. Ryan got bolder. Sensing that our parents were desperate, that they were losing ground, he started acting like he had already won. First, he began showing up unannounced, not just knocking on my door. Oh no, that would have been too normal for Ryan. Instead, I caught him snooping around my backyard, lurking like a burglary in progress, checking windows, as if he were casing my house like some thief waiting for the perfect opportunity. One evening, I came home late from work and found footprints in the snow leading up to my back porch. Ryan's size, 11 sneakers. I knew them anywhere. I checked my security camera footage. Sure enough, there he was creeping around like he was scouting the place. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just pushing boundaries anymore. He was testing them. And then he crossed the line. One Saturday, I got home and noticed something off. The deadbolt lock on my front door looked scratched. The screws slightly loose, as if someone had tampered with it. My stomach turned. I checked my spare key, the one I always kept in the kitchen drawer, gone. I knew who it was before I even confronted him. Ryan tried to change my locks. Tried. And failed miserably. I stormed over to my parents' house, furious, my hands shaking as I banged on the door. Ryan answered, his face blank, completely unfazed. You seriously thought you could just sneak in and take over? I snarled. He had the nerve, the absolute audacity, to shrug. We both know you're going to give in eventually, he said, smirking. Something in me snapped. I drove straight to the police station and filed a trespassing report. Then I called a locksmith, had every single lock replaced, and installed high-end security cameras, because at this point, I wasn't just protecting my house. I was protecting myself. The anonymous letters started soon after. Folded-up papers slipped into my mailbox. No return address, no signature. I opened the first one, and the words made my skin crawl. You're a terrible son. A greedy, selfish brother. You've forgotten where you came from. I knew the handwriting immediately. Some were my mother's, flowing cursive, filled with passive-aggressive self-righteousness. Others were my father's, short, clipped sentences, as if writing them pained him, but he did it anyway. They were actually trying to guilt me through anonymous hate mail. I sat there, staring at the letters, a sick mix of anger and disbelief washing over me. This was how far they were willing to go. And then the extended family attacks began. First, it was my Aunt Linda. She called out of nowhere, her voice dripping with disapproval. I just don't understand, she said, as if she had any stake in this. He's your brother. Why are you being so cruel? Then came my Uncle Dave, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, messaging me on Facebook with a vague, moralizing family comes first speech. Cousins, second cousins, even people I barely knew, all suddenly had an opinion. And my grandmother, who lived in a completely different country, left me a voicemail, her voice quivering with manufactured sadness. I am praying for your soul. My child, greed is a dangerous thing. Praying for my soul. Because I didn't give away my house. Because I had the audacity to stand up for myself. The breaking point? Ryan showed up at my workplace. Like he had every right to be there. Like humiliating me was just another way to force my hand. He strolled in during business hours, making a scene in the lobby, talking loudly about how I had screwed over my own family. Security had to escort him out. And then, the worst part, that afternoon, my boss called me into his office. Is everything okay at home? He asked, his tone careful, like he was debating whether or not to involve HR. I had never been so humiliated in my life. That night, I was done. I sent my parents a final, clear, uncompromising text. Ryan is not moving into my house. I don't care what you say, what you do, or who you try to manipulate. If you push this any further, I will cut contact. Permanently. And then, for the first time in months, silence. No phone calls. No texts. No virtriden voicemails. The holidays came and went without invitations. I was the black sheep now. But you know what? My house? Still mine. And my peace of mind? Absolutely priceless. Months passed, and the silence stretched on. At first, it was deafening. After years of constant interaction, phone calls, texts, family dinners, even the occasional uninvited drop-ins, suddenly there was nothing. No passive-aggressive messages from my mom. No disappointed sighs from my dad. No smug, self-righteous rants from Ryan. Just quiet. And it hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. No matter how angry I had been, no matter how justified I was in drawing my boundaries, there was still a part of me, the son, the brother, that felt the sting of rejection. The little voice in the back of my head that whispered, "What if you're wrong? What if you could have handled this differently?" I found myself thinking back to when I was a kid, when family did mean something. When holidays weren't a minefield, when my parents were my safety net, not a looming threat. When Ryan was just my younger brother, the one I built pillow forts with, the one I used to sneak out with to get fast food at midnight, the one who once split his Halloween candy with me when I had a bad year trick-or-treating. But then I'd remember what he had become, and I'd picture him in my house, sitting on my couch, feet up on my coffee table, treating my space like his own personal dumping ground while I worked my ass off to keep the lights on. Picturing the unpaid bills, the inevitable damages, the fights when I tried to enforce any kind of responsibility. Picturing him laughing it off while I struggled to fix his mess. And just like that, my doubt would disappear. I had made the right choice. No question. Then one evening, my phone rang. It was my mom. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, watching her name glow. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let it ring out like I had so many times before. But something, curiosity, maybe, or just a leftover piece of the son I used to be, made me pick up. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Not sharp, not scolding, not filled with disappointment or guilt. Just cautious, tentative, like she was afraid I might hang up before she even got the words out. "We miss you," she said. And then, after a pause, like she was gathering the strength to say something she didn't want to say, she added, "Your father, he's not doing well." I felt something shift in my chest, but I kept my voice even. "What's wrong?" A sigh. "He's been sick. He won't go to the doctor, but he's lost a lot of weight. He's tired all the time." She hesitated. "I know you're upset, but can we talk?" I hesitated too. Was this another trap? Another carefully orchestrated attempt to manipulate me back into the fold? But there was something in her voice, something real. And despite everything, despite all the anger and the resentment, a part of me wanted to believe her. "Fine," I said, "but on my terms." We met at a quiet cafe, neutral ground, a place where old wounds couldn't fester too loudly. When I saw them, I almost didn't recognize them. My dad, the man who had always been sturdy, strong, like nothing could shake him, looked smaller, thinner. His usual presence, the one that had once commanded rooms, now seemed faded. My mom, whose fire had always burned just beneath the surface, seemed diminished. They weren't here to fight. They weren't here to demand anything. They just wanted their son back. And in their own way, they apologized. Not in so many words. My parents weren't the kind of people to say, "I'm sorry," outright. But they said it in the way my mom reached for my hand, a rare moment of vulnerability. They said it in the way my dad, after all these months of silence, met my eyes and didn't look disappointed. Just tired. They didn't bring up the house. They didn't bring up Ryan. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect again. But it was something. Ryan, though, that was a different story. I ran into him not long after, at a grocery store of all places. I almost didn't recognize him, either. He looked the same, but there was a hardness to him now, something resentful and festering. And the second he saw me, his face twisted into a sneer. "Must be nice," he said, arms crossed, voice dripping with bitterness. Having everything handed to you. I actually laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that came out before I could stop it. Yeah, Ryan, I said, shaking my head. Must be nice. Because that was the thing about Ryan. He would never get it. In his mind, success wasn't something you worked for. It was something given to you, handed over, free of charge. He would never understand the long nights, the sacrifices, the exhaustion. He would never understand that no one had ever handed me anything, and I was done trying to make him see it. Some people don't want to change. Some people would rather be victims than take responsibility. And that was his burden to carry, not mine. My parents and I, we started to rebuild. Slowly, carefully, but the cracks remained. The trust wasn't fully restored, and maybe it never would be. Because I would never forget that they had tried to take something from me that I had worked my whole life to build. I would never forget that, when given a choice, they had chosen Ryan's comfort over my sacrifices. And that left a scar, a deep one. I wish they had never put me in that position. I wish they had seen me as more than just a safety net for my brother's failures. But in the end, I stood my ground. I kept what was mine. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just their son. I was my own person. And that was worth more than any house.